Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the IRB mini conference. I'm Lisa Greening. I'm the Director of Regulatory Services. And today I'm joined by our IRB specialist, Angie Luna and Kelly Handy, and then also our program coordinator, Amy Keller. So welcome, everybody. So to start off, I'll give the basic agenda of today's mini conference. So we'll be discussing first what human subject research is in the IRB, what the IRB is, and then we'll discuss informed consent and recruitment. Then we'll get into preparing an IRB submission and the application process and review process. We'll talk shortly about modifications, non-compliance, and then we'll finish off with information about protecting human subject data, electronic data. So use the chat function for any questions that you might have. We'll have time at the end for questions on things that weren't covered in the mini conference. This is a 3-hour conference, so we're going to cover a lot of information. So it might be good to hold your questions until the end, but of course, if there's something pressing, you can put it into the chat. Also, for this conference, we have 2 knowledge checks, which basically it's like a little quiz to see if you're retaining the information. So the person who puts the first correct answer in the chat for the quiz or the knowledge check wins a fast pass. And what a fast pass is basically a pass to the front of the line for IRB review and the IRB queue. So you can win this fast pass just once. So if the person who wins it the first time, you won't be eligible to win it a second time, but you're welcome to put in a correct answer if you'd like to in the chat whenever we're doing the knowledge check. Now, because we're covering human subjects protections in this mini conference, attendance here today also counts as human subjects protections training for a requirement for human subjects protections training. So to get this credit, you have to attend the conference for the majority of the time. And so since this is a recorded webinar, we're able to see how long you've attended the webinar and stayed in attendance. So we'll use those times as to whether or not we can issue that training certificate. And that would be issued in Mentis after the completion of the mini conference today. And we usually have those out within 2 to 3 days after a mini conference. So let's see, I think that's it. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the first section. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll start the next part. Let's see. Okay. That is not the right one. Hold on just a second.
Hi everyone, my name is Angie Luna and I am one of the IRB specialists here at UTA. In my session, I will be discussing human subject research and the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. In order to better understand our policies and protocol requirements, it's best to first discuss the history of human subject research. This will clarify why an IRB must review and approve all human subject research that occurs here at UTA, and how they serve to protect subjects and the objectivity of the research. Before the 1950s, there weren't very many policies or regulations that PIs were required to abide by. Research institutions often relied on a system of trust, where researchers were responsible for self-monitoring the ethical conduct of their own studies. Although trust is still a big big factor in research today, there were numerous cases of exploitation, treatment, and abuse within biomedical research that weren't caught as early as they should have been. We will discuss a few of these historical cases that have shaped our human subject research policies and procedures today. During World War II, Nazi physicians forced concentration camp prisoners to endure horrific experiments for research, including subjecting prisoners to freezing water, injecting live viruses into their blood, and injecting toxic substances like gasoline into the prisoners' eyes. By defining these humans as subhuman, Nazi medical science placed prisoners in the category of scientific specimens, and this did not protect them under German laws. In 1946, 20 Nazi physicians and 3 administrators were put on trial in Nuremberg, Germany, for war crimes and crimes against humanity for their willing participation in systematic torture, mutilation, and killing of prisoners in the experiments that were conducted during World War II. These trials were known as the Nuremberg trials, and as a result of these trials, 16 of the 23 Nazi defendants were found guilty. A new standard of required elements for conducting human subject research was developed and became known as the Nuremberg Code. This code requires voluntary and informed consent, the right to withdraw from a study without penalty, justification that the risks do not outweigh the benefits, avoidance of experiments that are expected to cause physical and/or mental suffering, and prohibits studies in which death or disabling injury is expected. Another historical study that shaped the IRB policies and regulations was the Tuskegee syphilis study that occurred in 1932. The U.S. Public Health Service was working with the Tuskegee Institute to study the natural disease progression of syphilis in African American males in hopes of justifying treatment programs for the Black community. When the study began, there were no known safe or effective cures for treatment of syphilis. The study initially involved 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without, and was originally intended to last only 6 months. The men were deliberately misinformed and misguided, as they were told that they would be receiving medical treatment during the study. However, treatment was withheld from the subjects for the entire duration of the study, even after penicillin became available as an effective cure for syphilis in 1947. The subjects were also not informed that they were allowed to quit the study. Although the study was questioned by some in the 60s, the study was allowed to continue until 1972, when the first public accounts of the study appeared in the national press. By the end of the experiment, only 74 subjects were still alive. 28 subjects died from syphilis, while 100 died from related complications. Around 100 of the men reported cases of disability. 40 subjects reported that their wives had been infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. This study lacked a true informed consent process and withheld information from the subjects that included an available treatment. They participants and their families by using deception and exploited a vulnerable population for the sole benefit of the researchers and science at the expense of the subjects and their families. In this study, researchers at the University of Chicago conducted a study on jury decision-making processes, which involved audio recording jurors' private deliberations. The purpose of this research was to measure the influence that attorney comments had on jurors and their decision-making processes. The judge and attorneys at the recorded trials knew that the research was being conducted. However, the jurors were not told that they were being studied, so as not to bias their behavior. After the trials were recorded, the tapes were played publicly at a law conference. And the overall concern, as reported to the local newspapers, was that deception was used in a setting where privacy and confidentiality are critically important. These concerns resulted in the 1956 federal law banning all recording of jury proceedings. The ethical issues with this study is the lack of informed consent, the invasion of privacy and falsification of confidentiality, and the use of deception within a legal institution. Code of research ethics for conducting biomedical research were developed after the Nuremberg trials. This code of ethics was published in 1964 and were last revised in 2013. The Declaration of Helsinki states that every human subject in a research study receive the best known treatment. Subject welfare always takes precedence over interests of science and society. Additional safeguards and considerations should be implemented when conducting research with vulnerable populations. And medical research conducted with a vulnerable population is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs or priorities of this group, and the research cannot be carried out in a non-vulnerable group. In addition, this group should stand to benefit from the knowledge, practices, or interventions that result from the research. Back in the United States, following the Tuskegee syphilis study, the National Research Act created the Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission was established to identify the basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects and to develop guidelines which should be followed to assure that such research is being conducted in accordance with those principles. The commission drafted the Belmont Report, a foundational document for the ethics of human subject research in the United States, and outlined the Code of Federal Regulations, adopted under the Department of Health and Human Services, Title 45, Part 46, Protection of Human Subjects. This title is also referred to as the Common Rule, and defines human subject research. The final revised Common Rule took effect on January 21, 2019, and the Common Rule outlines the requirements of and the guidelines for IRBs, as well as the policies for record-keeping requirements and the criteria for the review of research involving human subjects. Additionally, the Common Rule delineates the content of and requirements for the process of obtaining informed consent from participants, including those from vulnerable populations. The Belmont Report identifies three basic ethical principles for conducting research with human subjects: justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. When reviewing human subject research studies for approval, UTA always applies the Belmont Rule. The principle of justice states the selection of research participants should be equitable within the desired population and should not exclude a specific class or type of person who would likely benefit from the study. Anyone who could stand to benefit from the research should be offered the chance to participate and share the benefits of that research. The principle of beneficence states that researchers will make all reasonable attempts to secure well-being and to do no harm to the subjects. It is the researcher's responsibility to maximize possible benefits and to minimize possible harms or risks associated with the research activities. When appropriate, the researchers should make adequate provisions for monitoring the data being collected to protect the safety of the subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of the data. The last principle is respect for persons, states that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and persons from vulnerable populations are entitled to these additional safeguards. Voluntary and informed consent to participate will be sought from each prospective participant or the participant's legally authorized representative, and it should be appropriately documented in accordance with the regulations. When appropriate, adequate provisions will be utilized to protect the privacy and confidentiality of participants. Additionally, participants will be given to withdraw from the study without penalty or consequence. An Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is an ethics committee that is created to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. They ensure that there is a risk to benefit analysis to ensure the risks do not outweigh the benefits of the study. They ensure that adequate informed consent is sought from subjects, including requests for waiving or modifying the written informed consent process. They ensure there are adequate provisions for the privacy and confidentiality of the collected data, and they ensure the protection of vulnerable populations. The responsibilities of IRBs are formally defined in Subpart A of the Common Rule. Here's a list of the federal requirements expected of an IRB. An IRB must have at least 5 members of various race, gender, and cultural backgrounds, and must consist of both affiliated and non-affiliated scientists and non-scientists. Affiliated is referring to the institution in which the members serve. And an example of an affiliated IRB member would be a faculty member from the School of Social Work here at UTA. An unaffiliated member would be a member from the surrounding community that does not work for or have any affiliation with UTA. IRB members should have expertise in reviewing and evaluating research protocols and procedures. They should also have experience with vulnerable populations to ensure the subjects from these populations are being fully protected by the approved research. Lastly, IRB members should be familiar with the federal regulations, state and local laws, internal policies and procedures, and the standards of ethical conduct. The IRB at UTA is composed of 7 voting members and 15 alternate members, which consist of 2 unaffiliated members from the community. We currently have 3 physician consultants and 1 pharmacist consultant. These consultants assist the IRB with reviewing protocols that might require additional biomedical or pharmaceutical expertise that's beyond the scope of the IRB. These reviews ensure that the studies are being conducted safely and that the subjects are being fully protected. Our IRB consists of members spanning across various departments here at UTA. At this time, we currently have members from the departments of kinesiology, nursing, psychology, bioengineering, social work, education, physics, engineering, the Environmental Health and Safety Department, and the University Compliance Office. As mentioned earlier, we also have 2 unaffiliated community members that serve on our IRB. These board members are both from the city of Arlington, and one of them serves as our prisoner advocate. The IRB is responsible for the ethical review of research involving human subjects. The IRB has the authority to approve or disapprove all human subject research studies, to require changes to the proposed research, and to review any requested changes or modifications before they can be implemented. The IRB serves to ensure adequate informed consent is sought from participants, including pending modifications made to already approved written informed consent processes. Following approval, they also monitor and could possibly audit protocols and their collected data throughout the lifetime of the study, and they have the authority to suspend or terminate any study approval. The first thing that must be determined when we receive a protocol is whether it constitutes as research, and then whether it can be classified as human subject research. In this picture here, you will see our electronic protocol submission platform, Mentis. This is where you will house everything pertaining to your protocol application, consent forms, surveys, list of personnel, etc. Before we can discuss the ins and outs of the protocol requirements and your Mentis submission, we first need to discuss research. To begin, we should break down the definition of research. Research is defined as a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, that's designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. A human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator, whether a professional or a student, is conducting research and obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual or through receipt of identifiable private information, even if no intervention or interaction with the researcher occurs. Information about human subjects can be collected in 3 ways: through interaction, intervention, or secondary use of private identifiable data or biological samples. Through interaction, researchers can collect data through communication or interpersonal contact with subjects. Through intervention, researchers can collect data through physical procedures or manipulations of the subject and/or their environment. Lastly, researchers can also collect data that was originally collected for a purpose other than the research purpose through the secondary use of private identifiable data or from biological samples. This slide shows a few examples of human subject research activities. So any preliminary feasibility or pilot study, any form of interview, focus group, surveys, or questionnaires that's asking subjects to provide their opinion on something or their feedback, any use of identifiable student or employment record reviews, any study obtaining physical or biomedical measurements, any form of psychological and/or social interventions, any form of clinical trial with or without drugs or devices, and any observations of behavior with or without research intervention. Some examples of studies that would not qualify as human subject research include oral history projects, class projects that are solely being submitted for a grade, or any quality improvement or program evaluations that are intended to improve or evaluate internal procedures or processes that aren't intended to contribute to generalizable knowledge. For instance, if you're assigning students to complete a project that requires them to conduct their own research or involves interaction with human subjects, but that project is solely being conducted to achieve a grade and will not be continuing once it has been submitted, then it would not be considered human subject research, and the students in your class would not need to obtain IRB approval. We've also received a few questions recently from faculty members who are interested in using assignments that students were required to turn in as a grade for use in future research. And our answer for this depends on the original intent of the assignment. If the assignment was given to the students with no intention of it being used in future research, then any project utilizing these assignments would be considered a secondary research project, which is human subject research that involves analyzing data that was originally collected by someone else for a different purpose, often without any direct interaction with the study participants. Researchers use secondary data to explore new questions, identify trends, or to validate findings while adhering to ethical guidelines to protect participant privacy and confidentiality. But if there is intent to use the submissions for research, and you know this before the students are given the assignment, then you would need to obtain IRB approval and before obtaining consent and issuing this assignment to students, because this would be considered a primary research project. It should be noted that for secondary research projects, any receipt, access, or use of completely de-identified data would not be considered human subject research and would therefore not require IRB review and approval. De-identified data would be any data set that only contains information about living individuals that has all the identifiers removed in a manner that any member of the research team would not be able to identify the individuals from whom the data was collected. Links between the data and the individual might still exist, but for instance, through a code or indirect identifier, but they are not readily accessible and would not be made available to the researchers at UTA. It should be noted that primary research studies, where the engaged researchers in that study are the ones implementing a coding system to replace direct identifiers with an indirect identifier like a participant ID, and intend to utilize a master list that will link the subjects and codes to their identifiable data, would not be considered de-identified, but would instead be considered coded data. And we would still consider coded data to be a form of identifiable data. But the coding mechanism is considered an extra layer of protection for keeping the collected data secure. Should someone outside of the research team be responsible for removing the identifiers, and you're receiving the data in this way with no access to a master list or any other information that could possibly identify the subjects, then that data would be considered de-identified. There are lots of scenarios where the projects may fit in the category of human subject research or might not, but there are additional factors to consider that could potentially affect our determination of whether or not it would actually be considered human subject research. For instance, the intent or motivation of the project, the design of the project, the population, the benefits, or even the way the results will be disseminated. All of these factors should be considered when reviewing your project and determining whether it needs IRB review. This chart, which is available on our website, will walk you through the details of your project to determine what type of project the study would be considered and whether it would be classified as human subject research. If there are ever questions you have about your study and whether it would be considered human subject research that requires IRB review and approval, we are always happy to help with this. We just ask that you be as detailed as possible in your request for assistance so that we can walk through this table with you and make a determination. It's important to check with us if you have questions about whether your project requires IRB review before you begin the study. All studies that fit the definition of human subject research must be reviewed and approved by the IRB before any research can be conducted. One of the most important requirements for students who plan to conduct human subject research is to ensure that you have a faculty advisor chosen to assist with your project. The faculty advisor will be responsible for reviewing your submission before it gets submitted for IRB coordinator review. Once they've reviewed it, they will be the ones responsible for submitting all of your documentation for IRB review and approval. Students won't be able to submit projects to the IRB without a faculty advisor submitting it on their behalf. So yes, students can be listed as the principal investigator for the study or as the PI for the project, but the system will not let you proceed without having a faculty advisor listed in the protocol personnel. You can find further information about regulatory services and the different areas of research that we cover on our website shown here. From this homepage, you can access any of our pages on IACUC or animal subjects, IRB or human subjects, RCOI, research conflict of interest, export control, responsible conduct of research, recombinant DNA, dual use research of concern, and our important news and announcements page. Homepage for the IRB, or human subjects. From here, you can access all of our IRB resources that we have provided for researchers conducting human subject research. From here, you can access our Submitting an IRB Protocol page, which gives you an idea of what our review queue looks like, and I'll discuss this a little more on our next slide. And this is also where you can access the project comparison chart that I mentioned previously that assists you in determining whether your project will require IRB approval. You can also access our IRB forms and templates page, which houses all of our required documents for IRB submissions, as well as the pages detailing the responsibilities for principal investigators and faculty advisors. We also have a web page that includes guidance for researchers, which houses a lot of resources to assist researchers in understanding the requirements for IRB submissions, a page just for data security and tips for protecting human subject data. We also have web pages about our required training modules, our policies and procedures, and our IRB meeting schedule and IRB roster. Basically, this is where you're going to find all of our helpful content and resources that we have put together for researchers conducting human subject research. So this is our Submitting an IRB Protocol step-by-step instruction page. And this page is a great resource. We will often send people here when they have questions about how to submit a IRB protocol for the first time or what we're looking for when it comes to IRB review and approval. It contains step-by-step instructions for how to submit a protocol for IRB review and approval. The steps include reminders for what attachments and information should be detailed within the submission, and we've also included an FAQ section that answered some of our most frequently asked questions. One of the best things on this page is our queue tracker, and we update this page every week to include the number of protocols currently awaiting IRB review. This tracker serves as a reference for what researchers can expect as far as review times. For most of this semester, our queue has been at an all-time high, and we have been working to get it back in order and get out of this high volume status that we're in. At this time, investigators can expect all submissions to take about 4 to 6 weeks to get through the review process, so please plan accordingly. Also, when submitting your protocol, highly advise that you are submitting a protocol that is well written and includes all criteria for IRB approval. Submitting a protocol that is incomplete or lacking details may need to be returned to the PI or faculty advisor for revision, and this will further delay the approval process. We have great resources on this page to ensure your submission is good quality and goes through our review process quickly. The last thing I want to briefly cover is multi-site research and our IRB reliance procedures. You can find this webpage by visiting our Guidance for Researchers page and selecting multi-site research. This is a very helpful page for any investigator involved in research projects at other institutions or who plan to engage non-UTA collaborators on their study. If your study was reviewed and approved by another institution, then we would likely defer to them as the IRB of record for the study. Your duty as a collaborator from UTA is to submit the IRB approval letter and a copy of the IRB protocol application to us in Mentis. Once we receive your submission, we will reach out to the other institution on your behalf to initiate a reliance agreement. If your UTA study will take place at multiple sites outside of UTA campus, then you will need to list these sites in your application with details about what procedures will take place at each of these sites, along with including a site permission letter to conduct research at each location if this is needed. If you're coming from another institution and you would like to transfer a study to UTA, there's a few questions we would need to ask in order to determine how we proceed. For instance, if you were the PI on this study at another institution and there are no other personnel listed on the study, then it is likely that your other institution will be opting to close it. In this scenario, we would ask that you submit the IRB protocol application and all of our required forms for UTA IRB to review the protocol and approve it. Unfortunately, the process is not as simple as transferring the IRB approval to another institution. If you are not the PI for the study and/or there will be active personnel who will continue carrying out the research at the other institution, then all that will be needed from the UTA researcher is to submit the IRB approval letter and a copy of the protocol application to us in Mentis. Just as I mentioned earlier, this would be for us to determine whether we will need to conduct our own review of the study or if we can initiate a reliance to rely on the determination of the IRB at the other institution. These situations can be tricky, so we're always happy to go over this with you. If there's any questions you have while you're working through your submission, we also offer some great guidance on our web pages, especially the one that's shown in this slide, which can be accessed by following the link provided at the bottom.
All right, excellent. And we had a few questions come in during that section, and I was just about to answer one of the questions about anonymized patient data from an open database. That doesn't sound like it needs IRB approval, but you'll likely need the IRB to confirm that that is indeed an anonymized data that you'll be getting. So what you'll do is email regulatory services to get the IRB to review it and issue that letter that we've been talking about in the chat. So yeah, okay. So the next section is informed consent. So let me pull that up. Let's see.
Andy, and I am one of the IRB specialists at UTA. In this section of the conference, I will discuss the basics of informed consent and recruitment and talk about the importance of consent in research. Earlier, we talked about several times that research violated the rights and welfare of subjects because they did not understand that they were participating in research, or they were not given an opportunity to choose if they wanted to participate in research. Because of these ethical breaches, we now have established principles designed to protect research participants. The requirement for informed consent is based on the principle of respect for persons, which is one of the ethical principles described in the Belmont Report. Respect for persons requires that subjects have the right to make informed decisions about what happens to them. Informed consent is defined as the process of communication between an investigator and a research subject, where the subject is fully informed about the research and they are given an opportunity to decide if they would like to participate. This process starts the very first time a researcher contacts the subject, such as through an advertisement about the study, and continues throughout the entire life of the study. Usually, informed consent is presented as a document that the researcher will discuss with the potential subject to ask them to participate in their research study. During this process, subjects are fully educated about the study procedures in a manner that they can easily understand, including the risks and benefits. During this process, subjects are given an opportunity to ask questions about the study, and they are given a chance to say no or choose to ask more questions before deciding whether to participate. Their voluntary willingness to participate is then documented, and that is typically done by signing the consent form. UTA requires that all IRB submissions involving the collection of data from human subjects to include a plan for informed consent, regardless of study classification or review type, because this is fundamental to protecting the rights and welfare of subjects. Informed consent is a process that involves two parties, the principal investigator and the potential subject. The PI involved in informed consent is primarily responsible for making sure that every subject is properly recruited and undergoes the full process of informed consent. They do have the option of delegating this responsibility to fully trained research personnel, but as the PI, they are still ultimately responsible for the informed consent process. It's also important to note here that research personnel who obtain informed consent should be appropriately trained, very knowledgeable about the research activities, and able to answer questions about the study. So the principal investigator should take precautions to ensure anyone responsible for informed consent is well trained. The investigator or designee responsible for obtaining consent has several responsibilities that are important to making sure consent is properly obtained. Researchers should describe the study procedures and timeline accurately and explain what participation entails, regardless of the complexity of the study procedures, whether it's a survey, focus group, or collection of a biospecimen. Participants need to be given time to think about the study and ask questions before they decide to enroll. The language used should never be coercive and should instead focus on accurately explaining the purpose and the background of the study. Researchers should also avoid undue influence when obtaining consent. What this means is that if a researcher has a position of authority and they are consenting someone in a position that does not have that same level of perceived authority, the potential subject may feel unduly influenced to sign the consent form. An example of this type of relationship is a professor trying to recruit a student. This doesn't mean that a professor cannot recruit a student, but rather that the professor needs to take precautions to ensure the student is not being influenced to participate. The consent form needs to be written in lay terms that someone without a scientific background can easily understand. A general rule of thumb to follow here is that consent forms should be written at an 8th grade reading level. Finally, consent needs to be properly documented. This is a signature, but when specific conditions are met, the IRB can approve other forms of documentation of informed consent, such as checking a yes/no box to indicate consent. Consent should be documented exactly as described in your IRB protocol. The informed consent document is required to contain several elements to ensure that subjects are presented with appropriate information about the study. These are federally required elements of consent and should be included in each consent form regardless of the study. The consent form should state that the study is research, the purpose and background of your research, including how long it's going to last and all the research activities, because those things allow potential participants to know if the research is a good fit for them and their lifestyle. Your consent should also explain the risks and benefits of participating, both for the subject directly and for society. This is very important because people need to fully understand the associated risks before deciding to participate. The consent form should also clearly state the participation is voluntary and participants can withdraw consent at any time with no penalty. The consent form should describe any alternative options to participating in the research. Consent should also include a description of confidentiality and explain how research data will be maintained. The document needs to explain who has access to inspect the records outside of the research personnel and explain how any collected paper or electronic data will be kept secure and how long it will be stored after the study is closed. The consent form should also contain information about compensation or if their participation will incur any costs that they will be responsible for, like parking costs, for example. For research that involves more than minimal risk, the form should also explain whether any compensation or medical treatments will be available in case an injury occurs. Consent forms should also address whether the researcher plans to use their data for future research purposes that are not described. Subjects should know if their samples or data will be used for future research purposes that are not described in the consent form. And finally, consent forms should also include contact information for the research team so participants know who to contact if they have questions or a problem comes up, or if they change their mind about participating in the study. The consent form should also include the contact information for the IRB for questions or to report a complaint about the study. All of these required elements need to be written at an 8th grade reading level in simple language that a non-scientist can understand. UTA has informed consent document templates on our website to fit every study type, and these documents contain all of the required elements of informed consent. Here is a screenshot of our website where you can find our templates we have for different types of studies. Each of these templates contains all of the required elements of informed consent that were just discussed. We have one for adults, we have a condensed version for minimal risk studies, 2 for clinical trials and biomedical studies, one of which is for federally funded studies, and we also have a form for studies with both parents and children. Finally, we have a broad consent template which can be used in limited circumstances for storage, maintenance, and secondary research of identifiable private information or biospecimens where the specific future use is not yet established. If you are unsure as to which template is appropriate for your study, please feel free to reach out to us for assistance. And just remember that when you use our template, always download the most recent version from our website so you don't use an out-of-date version that has old information. So just to recap the last few slides, informed consent is the process whereby a researcher shares information about a study with a potential subject and gives them time to decide whether they would like to participate in the research. After making their decision, participants document their decision by signing the informed consent document. After subjects provide consent, the researchers should also give them a copy of the consent form for their reference. Documenting consent is very important because it records that the researcher appropriately presented consent and that the subject is deciding to participate of their own free will. If you are the researcher, make sure that you are documenting consent in the manner approved in your IRB protocol. Okay, so what we just talked about covers the basics of informed consent for adults. But some studies may also want to recruit children or individuals under the age of 18. Children are a potential vulnerable population because they have limited autonomy and are more at risk of various harms in research, so they require additional protections when they are research subjects. Instead of consent, which we just talked about, children need to provide what is called assent to participate. Assent is the term used to express willingness to participate in research by people who are too young to provide informed consent, but old enough to understand the proposed research and the activities expected of them as subjects. In Texas and in most states, people under the age of 18 cannot provide assent by themselves. So if research involves children or minors, the researcher will also need to obtain consent from the child's parent in addition to obtaining assent from the child if they are old enough to understand what you're asking of them. If the age range of the child you are recruiting is older and has the capacity to understand your research, it's likely appropriate for you to obtain both parental consent and assent from the child. In some cases, like if the child is too young or they lack the capacity to understand the research, the IRB may waive the assent requirement. The next thing we are going to discuss is what to do if you need to alter the informed consent process. In some cases, there are elements of consent or documentation of consent that may be waived. The researcher will need to submit a waiver, and the IRB will make a determination on whether elements of consent or documentation can be waived for this specific study. The IRB will review these waivers on a case-by-case basis, and it's important to remember that submitting a waiver does not guarantee that it will be approved. The IRB may grant your waiver in specific circumstances and with appropriate justification, but just submitting a waiver does not necessarily mean it will be approved. The researcher has to provide sufficient justification to the IRB, and that can vary depending on your study. To request a waiver or alteration of the required elements of consent, the IRB will need to see that these 4 conditions are met. First, that the research is no more than minimal risk. The waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of participants, that the research could not be carried out without the waiver, and when appropriate, participants will be provided with additional information after their participation. Some studies may want to waive documentation of consent. These conditions needed to waive documentation are a little bit different because the IRB will need to see that at least one of these conditions is met. That the only record linking the subject and the research would be the consent document, and the principal risk would be potential harm resulting from a breach of confidentiality. That the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. Or if subjects or legally authorized representatives are members of a distinct cultural group or community in which signing forms is not the norm, that the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects, and provided there is an appropriate alternative mechanism for documenting that informed consent was obtained. So the type of waiver the researcher submits will depend on what portion of the consent process they wish to alter. The IRB will make a determination on whether to approve the waiver after reviewing the justification that the researcher provides. I mentioned that waivers to consent are determined on a case-by-case basis by the IRB. There are limits to when consent can be altered or waived. I want to go over a few reasons or justifications that the IRB would not accept a waiver or alteration of consent. First, convenience. Researcher convenience or difficulty is not an appropriate reason to justify waiving consent. Participants have a right to make decisions, and it's important that their rights and welfare are protected. Second, cost. Cost is also not a sufficient reason to waive consent because ethical considerations take precedence over cost. Speed. It can take time to cover informed consent with participants, but this is not a reason to waive the requirement. The IRB may suggest ways to obtain consent in a more efficient manner if a researcher is concerned about cost or speed, but these alone cannot be used to justify waiving informed consent. And finally, the risk level alone. Just because a study is minimal risk does not mean that consent is optional. A minimal risk study still involves some level of risk that a participant would not otherwise have if not enrolled. So unless other criteria are met, even minimal risk studies should still obtain consent. If you have concerns about how to obtain consent for your study, I suggest reaching out to our office with any questions because we would be happy to provide guidance on consent and whether a waiver or alteration is a good choice for your study. Okay, so moving on to recruitment. Recruitment is the process of advertising your study to find subjects that are interested in participating. Like I mentioned before, recruitment is where the consent process begins. because consent starts the moment a subject sees your recruitment materials. You have a lot of flexibility here to use whatever method or material is necessary to share your study with the public. You can use flyers, emails, ads on social media like Instagram or Facebook, television, radio, or you can simply rely on word of mouth methods to recruit. The researcher should choose the method that makes the most sense to reach their subject population. One thing to note here, if you will be posting on private social media pages or private listservs or accessing information that is not publicly available, the IRB will need to see a permission letter stating that you have permission to access that information or post on that particular site before the recruitment method can be approved. UTA does not have templates for recruitment since this is going to be unique and tailored for each study. While we don't have a specific list of elements that you must have, there are a few general rules to keep in mind when you're designing recruitment material. First, the recruitment documents should be somewhat brief and limited to generating interest in your study. So you'll want to briefly describe the study and the goal in a way that generates interest. The materials should include information about subject eligibility and the type of subject the researcher wants to enroll. So if there's a particular age range or medical condition or occupation, for example, that should be listed on the flyer or other recruitment material so potential subjects can see if the study is applicable to them. Some researchers also want to include information about compensation, which is a good idea, but it is important to not put undue emphasis on it. The material can provide compensation information, but that shouldn't stand out more than the rest of the information. Researchers designing recruitment material should make sure that all the information in their materials is accurate and not unduly influential. This is important because when the IRB reviews your recruitment materials, they will be checking to make sure the benefits to participation/compensation are not overstated or presented in a way that would cause undue influence on subjects. So in closing, informed consent is an ongoing process that ensures participants understand the study and voluntarily agree to participate. This process begins the first time that a participant sees recruitment material and continues throughout the life of the study. IRB approval is required before recruiting participants or obtaining consent. Remember to always use the most up-to-date IRB approved forms. Recruitment and consent must be ethical. All forms used must avoid coercion, use clear language, and prioritize participant rights and welfare at every step of the research study. If you have any questions, you can let us know in the chat, or you can reach out to our office later for guidance on consent and recruitment. Thank you.
Right, great. Okay. We had a question in the chat. I was writing a response. Oh, Angie put one in. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to know that at the beginning. In the way the application is set up, we kind of ask you, like in the second or third section, to give the risk level. And if you're not sure, go back to that once you've written all the risk in the risk section and all the mitigations and all that stuff. Once you've written all that out, that will probably give you a better idea of whether or not it's minimal risk or not. And you can take a guess. And then when the IRB reviews it, we review for risk level 2, and we'll see all the risks. And if we feel like it's a different risk level, we'll let you know in feedback if you need to change that risk level. Yeah. Okay, let's see. I think, yes, it's knowledge check time. So as a reminder, this is like a little quiz. So the first person to answer the question correctly Oh, shoot. The first person to answer this correctly wins a fast pass. So let me share it and just put the letter of the answer. All right. Yep. Y'all got it. B. That's correct. B is correct. So the first B we got was Jonica Davis. So you're the winner of the Fast Pass. Yay. All right. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So now we're going to move into the section on preparing an IRB submission. Oh, I see that we have other questions. Let me get to that before we go to that. Is the LGBTQIA considered an at-risk population? Potentially. It depends on the questions you're asking that population. I'm assuming because if you're studying that population, you're going to be asking questions about their community or their experience. And so that you could potentially be collecting sensitive information. So really, it's not that they're an at-risk population, they're considered like a vulnerable population because of confidentiality reasons and privacy reasons. The stigmatizing things that might come with collecting information about their experiences. And really the simple solution to that is making sure you have good data protections and data privacy and how you're collecting the data, that you collect data in private environments. If you're doing, surveys and things like that, that you keep, keep access to identifiable information to need to know, things like that. So it's all in the design of the study in protecting vulnerable populations. Let's see. Another question. For my minimal risk study, I plan to recruit through email or short class announcement. Do I need to attach the exact text of the recruitment email for the flyer if I use one? Or is it sufficient to describe the recruitment process in the IRB application? That's a good one. Yes, we'd like to see the actual text of the recruitment, like if what you intend to put into an email or the flyer, we need to see the text. And the reason we need to see that, or the IRB needs to see that, is the IRB needs to check for undue influence of any kind. Undue influence is that kind of pull into research, like making it seem like it's really exciting and all that stuff, or coercion, which is that push into research where people feel like they have to participate. We check for that kind of language. Most investigators are really good about not creating language in this way. And then really what we're checking too for is that it's consistent with what you put into your application, like the intent of the study. Are you recruiting the age ranges that you say you are, things like that, that it's all consistent and it matches. So that's why we need to see it. So yes, the answer is yes. Let's see. Okay, great. Okay, let's see. Let me get to the next section. Right. And y'all have some great questions. Okay.
I don't think the sound is working.
All right, sorry about that. Let me try again.
This section of the presentation will discuss how to prepare your IRB submission and provides a breakdown of the IRB review process. I will discuss the process step by step from the start of the application to the closure of the study in Mentis. It is important to give yourself a sufficient amount of time to prepare your protocol submission before any expected or anticipated deadlines. In the next few slides, I'll discuss some things that you should consider. This is our Submitting an IRB step-by-step guidance page. This is a great resource to utilize if you are new to the submission process or if you just want to double check that everything you have prepared is ready for review. Within each dropdown, we have included information about each of the submission process. And at the very top of this page, we also post the number of protocols that are currently in our queue awaiting coordinator review. This is a great indicator for how busy our office is and gives you an idea of how early in advance you should plan to submit your study for the approval process. Student PIs at UTA are to have a faculty advisor listed on their protocol. Once a submission is complete and ready for IRB review, the student PI will be required to submit the protocol to their faculty advisor in Mentis. It is the faculty advisor's responsibility to review the submission, ensure everything is accurate and complete, and then they will be responsible for submitting the protocol on the student's behalf for IRB coordinator review. If you are a student, it's important to communicate with your faculty advisor regularly throughout the submission process. Ensure that your protocol is being reviewed and submitted for IRB review in a timely fashion. If edits or corrections are needed, it is possible that the faculty advisor may return it back to you to make these changes before we even receive it in our office. Communication is definitely key to ensure these things are moving smoothly throughout the review process. If you are a master's student submitting a research protocol, our office advises that you submit the protocol at least one semester before your planned graduation. If you're a doctoral student, we advise at least 9 months in advance. The reason behind this suggestion is because our office cannot guarantee the IRB review process will be completed in sufficient time if you do not plan ahead. In other words, improper planning would not be a justifiable reason for the IRB to review your study ahead of the other studies awaiting review in the queue. All protocols are reviewed in the order they are received. Just a reminder that you can check our Submitting an IRB Protocol webpage to find our queue tracker. While this doesn't necessarily give you a definite timeline to prepare for, it does give you an idea of how busy our office is. The higher the number, the longer you will need to wait in order to receive a preliminary review. At this time, it's fairly normal for our queue to be in the 30s. At the beginning and end of a semester, it should be expected that this number will be higher than normal. So keep this in mind while you are preparing for your submission. The second step in the submission process is ensuring that all personnel and collaborators on the project have completed their required training for the type of protocol you are submitting. It's also important to consider whether any previously completed training has expired and needs to be renewed. In the next few slides, I will discuss some of our training modules, when they will be required, and how long each module is valid for. HSP training must be renewed every 3 years. This is a requirement for all researchers, UTA personnel, and non-UTA collaborators. If your study has non-UTA collaborators engaged in the research, they will not be able to access our HSP training in Mentis. In order to access that website, they will need UTA login credentials. All non-UTA collaborators should provide a copy of their HSP training completion certificate that was completed at their institution or through another training platform like City Program. We have a multi-site and IRB Reliance webpage that can be accessed from our IRB homepage. And here you will find a list of equivalent modules as well as links to modules that we recommend for collaborators that are not affiliated with another institution. Again, regardless of their role in the study, any researcher engaged in human subject research must have active HSP training. Some studies may require personnel to complete additional training. For instance, if your study will utilize NSF funding, you may be required to complete the Responsible Conduct of Research training or RCR training. If your study has NIH funding or will utilize funding from any other PHS compliant agencies, you may be required to complete both Conflict of Interest training or COI training, as well as a COI disclosure. If your study has a clinical trial, or if it will utilize any FDA-regulated drugs or devices, then Good Clinical Practice Training or GCP training will be required for all personnel. Our office will inform you if any of these additional training requirements will apply, and if you would like to plan ahead, you can find this information listed on our website as well. We also have 2 different web pages specifically devoted to PI or Principal Investigator responsibilities and Faculty Advisor responsibilities. It is important to read through these responsibilities if you are planning to conduct research here at UTA. These responsibilities are expected of any researcher planning to serve as a PI for a research project, regardless if they are a faculty member, staff, or student. If a student will serve as this PI for a study, the faculty advisor listed on their study also has oversight responsibilities to ensure the research is being conducted ethically and in accordance with the approved protocol. Both of these pages can be accessed from our IRB homepage. The next step in the submission process is ensuring that all required forms have been completed and are ready for IRB review. This includes the protocol application, the consent form, and any supplemental documents that may be required for the type of protocol you are submitting. In the next few slides, I'll discuss the required forms for an IRB submission and where each of them can be located. The next step in the submission process is to ensure that your submission has a completed IRB application form and an informed consent document. Informed consent is required for all research studies. We have different types of consent documents and templates for each type posted on our forms webpage. Your submission should also include copies of any data collection instruments that you intend to use in your study. This includes copies or screenshots of any surveys, the script or list of questions that will be asked during interviews or focus groups, as well as any recruitment language or materials that you plan to use. If you intend to utilize non-public contact information, you will also be required to attach permission letters or communication granting you permission to utilize the non-public resource for research purposes. A few examples of this may include access to a listserv, private social media groups, or recruiting from other institution or private entities. We have 2 different protocol applications. The first application shown on the left is our primary research application, and this application should be used for any research study with humans that will involve either interaction with subjects or a form of intervention. The application on the right is our secondary research application, and this application should be used for any research study that will use private or identifiable data that have been collected or will be collected for non-research purposes. This would include use of information from a data bank or records, or utilizing biospecimens or excess blood from a lab. There are prompts at the beginning of each application that describe what type of research each application should be used for. But if you have any questions about what type of research project your study would fall under, please feel free to reach out to us. Please ensure that all questions in the application have a response, even if you are just notifying us that certain portions of the document do not apply. If an incomplete application is received by our office, we will return it back to the PI for edits, and upon resubmission, it will be entered into the bottom of the queue. If you have questions about some of the sections and how to provide a response, please feel free to reach out to us before you submit. The first section of our protocol application is where you will list all collaborators who will be interacting with subjects or who will have access to identifiable data that are not affiliated with UTA. Along with listing each collaborator in the first part of the application, the non-UTA collaborator will also be required to complete a non-UTA collaborator form that provides details about the institution they are affiliated with, their role in the study, and where data collection procedures will take place, and contains their contact information. Each collaborator will also be required to provide proof of HSP training completion. This can be provided from a module completed at their institution or from one of the provided training module options listed on our multi-site research and reliances page. Collaborator engaged in the research, our IRB will contact their institution to initiate reliance procedures. This is basically an agreement between institutions that one IRB will rely on the review determination of the other IRB that will serve as the reviewing IRB for the project. This eliminates the need for researchers to obtain review and approval from both institutions for the same study. While our office does this on the collaborator's behalf, it is also important that the collaborator communicate with their own IRB to ensure they are compliant with their requirements. The second question on the application requests PIs to provide an estimate for when the study is expected to begin and when it is expected to end. It's important to note that no portion of the human subject research project can begin until IRB approval is obtained. This includes subject recruitment. The next section is where the PI will add their funding source. It's important to list all funding sources that will be utilized for your project to ensure appropriate regulations are being applied. For any external funding sources, a Mentis Blue Sheet number will be required for each award. If you are offering subjects any form of monetary compensation, there must be a funding source listed. The next section is about the risk classification for your project. To determine how your project should be classified, we refer directly to the definitions. Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests, and that confidentiality is adequately protected. Greater than minimal risk refers to research activities that do not meet the definition of minimal risk. Researchers will be asked to assess the risk level of their data collection procedures and indicate the risk level it falls under. The fifth question of the application is where you explain the primary research questions, hypotheses, and objectives that will guide the study. This section should clearly explain how the project meets the criteria of human subject research. The procedure section is very important and is one of the most common areas that IRB coordinators will return a protocol for. This section of the application should detail each data collection procedure in a step-by-step fashion from the very beginning of the research to the last communication. This section should include what data is being collected from subjects during each procedure, where the data will be collected, how the data will be collected, and when. It's important to note that this section should not appear as an overview or a summary. It must clearly detail each procedure. Also, the descriptions provided in this section should use clear and concise layman's language that can be easily understood by someone outside of your field. This may require additional definitions, explanations, or even pictures. This section should clearly display how many study visits will occur, what data is being collected from subjects in this research and how. If interviews or surveys will occur, the platform should be listed, and how subjects will be asked to access it should also be clear. If any portion of the study is being recorded, the type of recording should be clear, as well as what data is being captured. If there are optional elements to your research, or if the research is integrated into a course and is required for subjects to receive a grade, regardless of whether or not they choose to participate in the research, this should be fully detailed. Lastly, if your study will contain a lot of procedures, it's recommended to list the expected duration of each procedure in the description. Otherwise, in number 7 of the application, you should clarify how many visits and/or interactions with the subjects the study will contain, the amount of time required for each visit, and how long their total participation is expected to take over the entire duration of the study. It's important to ensure that the information provided in this section is consistent with details provided outside of your protocol application. For instance, if you provide an estimate here of a survey taking 5 minutes, but the consent form estimates a range between 5 and 10, the study will be returned. The estimated duration should be consistent across all documentation. The Alternatives to Participation section is intended to describe any available options that participants have if they choose not to participate in the research. An example of this would be if completion of your study will compensate subjects with extra credit. It is required for an alternative assignment to be offered to students in that course who are interested in obtaining extra credit, but who do not want to participate in the research. The alternative non-research option offered to students should be an assignment that requires equal effort, time, and awards the same amount of extra credit. The location and sites portion of the application should include all places where research procedures are expected to take place. If your study will take place in a lab, the building and/or room number should be provided. Specificity depends on the type of procedures being conducted in that lab. If your study will take place online, websites, platforms, apps, and software should be listed in this section. If any part of your study will take place at another institution or a location administratively separate from UTA, then a permission letter allowing the research to be conducted at this location should be included with your submission. In the person application section, all members of the research should be listed, as well as their role in the study and their relevant qualifications, training, or experience they may have to fulfill that role. The study oversight section is where the PI is expected to describe the communication plan with all listed personnel to ensure that all study procedures are being conducted ethically and in accordance with the approved protocol. If the PI is a student, this section should also include how the faculty advisor will oversee the student conducting the research. In the population section, the target population for the study should be described. For example, this could be subjects living within DFW, UTA students, and/or healthy young adults. In the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the eligibility criteria should be described. Inclusion criteria should describe the requirements for subjects to be eligible to participate in the study. The exclusion criteria should explain specific factors or criteria that would make the subject ineligible to participate. This section should describe how you intend to verify eligibility. For instance, will you be utilizing a pre-screening survey, listing the requirements in the recruitment materials, basing it off self-reporting, or are you utilizing a different method? The number of subjects you intend to enroll in your study should be a best estimate based on the type of study you intend to conduct. For minimal risk research projects, this is viewed as an estimate, and it's allowable to exceed this amount over the course of the study. If the research is greater than minimal risk, the estimated number should include the statistical justification and/or references for how this number was obtained. This number will also be viewed as a cap, and enrollment cannot exceed this number without an approved modification. The recruitment strategy should be described from first contact with a potential subject to the subject participating in the study procedures. This section should include all methods utilized to recruit subjects and how you will obtain their contact information if you are not planning to utilize publicly available information. For instance, if you have access to a listserv, or if you would like to recruit subjects from a course that you are teaching, a permission letter that allows use of these platforms for the purpose of research should be attached to your submission. If someone's going to share your recruitment materials on your behalf and private contact information is not being provided to the researchers, then a permission letter would not be required, but this should be clearly stated in the application. All recruitment materials should be listed in the application and attached for review in the submission. If you are recruiting by phone or in person, the script that will be used or the flyer that will be used to guide the discussion should be attached for review and approval. If you are planning to use subject pool posts like mTurk, Sona, or Prolific, The information posted about your research in those platforms should also be provided as part of your recruitment materials. The informed consent process is one of the most important parts of the research study. It's important that subjects are provided with sufficient information to understand the requirements of their participation and how their data will be collected and used. It's also important to note that you cannot obtain information about a person through another individual, such as from a family member or a friend, unless that person has also undergone the informed consent process themselves. In this section, describe all elements of the process: when it will happen, where it will happen, and how subjects will be providing their consent. If you're conducting a survey where subjects are just hitting "I agree," this would require a waiver of the written consent documentation requirement. In 17A, we want justification for why you are requesting to waive this. If your study is federally funded or FDA regulated, you will also need to attach the form. If you are intending to waive portions or elements of the consent process, this will also require the form with your provided justification and how you intend to document consent. This is a copy of our minimal risk consent form template. As you can see, we have included a lot of prompts and red text that are intended to assist you with providing all required details for this document. You simply need to plug information from the application into the consent form. Please be sure that any details that you are providing in your consent form are consistent with the details you have provided in your application. One of the most common return comments for consent forms tends to be that the study title is different or the eligibility criteria is too brief. We've even seen different compensation types and amounts between the consent form and the application. So please double check that everything is consistent before you submit it for review. It should also be noted that when you submit the document to us for review, all of the prompt language should be removed. Our office needs to review the document exactly how it will be issued to the participating subjects. This includes the way you intend to document the subject's consent. If the consent form requires a handwritten signature, we will stamp the most recent version of the consent form with the approval date and the version number. If the consent form does not require a signature or if it will be embedded into a survey, we typically do not stamp the consent form. Incomplete disclosure occurs when an investigator withholds information about the specific purpose, nature, or other aspect of the research. Deception occurs when an investigator gives false information to subjects or intentionally misleads them about some key aspect of the research. If you plan to utilize this in your study, you will need to provide your reasoning and whether subjects will be debriefed at the end of the study. This should also include the language or the statement that will be issued to subjects at the end of their participation. Please describe all details about your compensation method. This should include how much subjects will receive and whether it will be prorated for partial participation. When the compensation will be issued to subjects and how. Will they be receiving it in person in cash? Will they receive a gift card through email? For all methods, describe how it will be documented and how confidentiality will be maintained. If you are planning to utilize a raffle, clarify how this will be conducted and how the winners will be notified. If the compensation amount for participating subject groups differs in any way, you have to describe why. And if a subject does not answer all questions in a survey or leaves early, will they still qualify to receive compensation? All of these details should be considered and described in both the application and the consent form. Compensation tends to be our number one reason that our office receives complaints. The risk to subject section should clearly detail any actual or potential risks that subjects will encounter while participating in your study. This could be physical risk, falling or muscle soreness after exercise, or it could be psychological risks that may cause the subject to feel depressed, angry, or embarrassed while participating. There could also be social risks associated with participating in the study, especially if their identity will be known by others who are participating in the research. If you are conducting the study online or utilizing virtual platforms, there's always a potential risk to confidentiality. Also, if you are planning to recruit friends in your research, or if you are a teacher and you plan to recruit students that are enrolled in your current course, this could have influence on whether the potential subject decide to participate in your research or not. They may feel pressured or influenced based on the relationship dynamic. For each risk described, a strategy for minimizing it should be included in both the application and the consent form. Recently, we posted a new mental health resource that can be utilized by researchers, and this is now available on our website. If your study will involve blood draws, radiation, or x-rays, or utilize any devices that contain lasers, then additional approval from the Environmental Health and Safety Department will be required before the IRB can issue approval. For each procedure that applies to this section, the location, the exact materials or the equipment used, how blood, body fluid, tissues will be handled and stored, etc. This last section should contain a list of direct benefits the study may have on subjects participating in the research, as well as the expected or potential benefits that this research study will have to the field of study or the society at large. Be sure to address all aspects of subject privacy and confidentiality. Privacy refers to a subject's right to control access to themselves. So in other words, how will you conduct your study procedures to ensure the subject can maintain as much privacy while participating as they feel comfortable? If you're conducting an interview, are you ensuring that it's in a private place or controlling the environment in a way to prevent any situation where they may be exposed as a research subject or embarrassed? Confidentiality, on the other hand, is the researcher's responsibility in protecting subject data and ensuring that it is not disclosed without their permission. In this section of the application, we want to know what type of data your study will contain. For instance, will it contain names and recordings that would be directly identifiable? Will you collect identifiable data but later replace it with a coding mechanism to further protect against data breaches or exposing someone as a research subject? Will the subject be utilizing a pseudonym while participating that de-identifies that data from the research team, but is still linked to that participating subject across all procedures? Or will you be conducting a survey that collects no identifiers at all, and there's no way to know who is participating in your study? This section of the application should describe exactly how and where all paper and electronic data will be stored for the entire data retention period. It should be noted that data can only be maintained on UTA-sanctioned encrypted devices or software, unless additional exceptions are granted. We will be discussing these exceptions and considerations for data security a little more at the end of the presentation. If the PI is a student, or if it's known that the PI will be leaving UTA before the end of the data retention period, a long-term storage arrangement should be described in this section. If any part of your study could result in identifying child abuse, elderly abuse, communicable diseases, or criminal activities that would or could not have otherwise been identified, how do you plan to maintain confidentiality, and what is your plan of action if any of these are revealed? The data sharing section should provide details about any identifiable data collected in the study that will be shared outside of the research. If the study has data sharing, details should include where, when, and to whom the data will be shared. The last question on the application asks researchers to describe any actual or potential conflicts of interest. In other words, whether the PI or any of the protocol personnel have an affiliation, arrangement, or financial interest in the research that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. The end of the application serves as a reminder of some of the documents that may be required and should be submitted with your application in Mentis. This includes any surveys, questionnaires, interview questions, instructional materials, recruitment materials, permission letters, or documents for non-UTA collaborators. The IRB must review and approve any documents that will be issued to subjects as part of the research. It should be noted that if you are conducting a survey, a link in the application directing us to it can be helpful in some instances, but it is a requirement that screenshots or a PDF version of the survey be attached to the protocol submission in Mentis. This is our device form. If your study will utilize any medical devices, each device should be listed in this table, as well as the FDA status of the device and whether your study intends to test the safety or effectiveness of the device. All manuals and other relevant safety information for each device should be included in the submission for IRB review. Additional details about these requirements, along with definitions and further guidance on making these determinations, are included within the document and can be found on our Forms and Templates page. Once your application and consent form have been completed, you're ready to start the submission process in Mentis. The next few slides will walk you through the submission process. Once your submission is ready for IRB review, you will need to upload all of your documents into Mentis. This is an example of what a human subject research protocol looks like within Mentis. You will be assigned a protocol number and be required to list all UTA protocol personnel that will be engaged in the project. By clicking on the green Show Details button next to each researcher, you will also be able to view their training completion dates. And this is a helpful way to ensure that you stay on top of reminders. The box on the top right is filled in by the IRB staff following preliminary review. Mentis will require you to provide a protocol title and a brief summary of your project. Please ensure that the protocol title you intend to use in Mentis is consistent with the title you plan to use across all documentation. Lastly, you will be required to upload your protocol application, consent document, and any other data collection instruments or documents. This is the bottom of the submission. Here you will note that we have included a comment box. This can be used by the PI or researchers to add additional information that may be pertinent to the review. It is also the section of the submission where you will receive return comments from the IRB staff informing you of any missing details or documents or requesting edits or corrections. Our office does not get prompted when a comment is uploaded in the submission. We will not review this information until it is undergoing preliminary review. So if there's any time-sensitive information that we need to know about your study, please reach out to our office directly. Once the IRB has received a submission, many researchers wonder what the review process looks like. In the next few slides, I will describe the review process from the moment it is received in our inbox to when approval is issued in Mentis. This is our review flowchart that describes the pathways for the different types of human subject research that we review. Most of the studies we receive are minimal risk. And minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in the subject's daily life or during the performance of a routine physical or psychological examination or test. Greater than minimal risk would refer to research activities that do not meet the definition of minimal risk. The third option shown is reliance, and this is an agreement between institutions when UTA personnel are engaged in research outside of UTA. By knowing what category your study falls under, the flowchart, which is available on our website as well, will give you an idea of the pathway that your study will likely follow while being reviewed. Most studies are minimal risk and do not need to be reviewed by an IRB member or reviewed at a convened IRB meeting. If the study is greater than minimal risk, it will likely require review at a convened IRB meeting. If the study has federal funding or FDA-regulated devices or drugs, then it is likely that a single member of the IRB will need to conduct a final review of the project in order for you to receive approval. The IRB staff will inform you if your study requires review at a convened IRB meeting. When conducting a review, the IRB will consider whether the potential or actual risks are being minimized to the fullest extent possible. They're also ensuring that the potential or expected benefits justify exposing subjects to the risks outlined in the study. The IRB will review all data collection procedures to ensure that each step of the procedure is clearly detailed. The IRB will consider the type and amount of compensation being issued to subjects and will ensure that it is reasonable and fair. The IRB will also consider the type of data that will be collected in the study and whether the outlined security measures are sufficient in protecting subject privacy as well as subject confidentiality. Following a preliminary review of the submission, the IRB specialist will likely return the protocol back to you to request any necessary revisions or clarifications. Once it is sent back to you, Mentis will send a notification email. You can view the request for revisions or clarifications in the comment section of your protocol submission in Mentis. Once you have completed all necessary revisions, you will need to resubmit the protocol for a final review. If your protocol is minimal risk, or if the study has federal funding and qualifies for review under one of the exempt categories, then the IRB coordinators will be able to issue approval. If your protocol will be reviewed under one of the expedited review categories, once the IRB coordinators have deemed that the study is ready for approval, they will send the protocol to a single member of the IRB who will either review and approve the protocol or return it back with conditions for approval. If your protocol is greater than minimal risk or requires review at an IRB meeting, the IRB coordinator will inform you of the meeting date your protocol will be reviewed at. The IRB meets every second Tuesday of the month. Once you've been issued IRB approval, it should be noted that additional steps may be needed or should be considered. For instance, if you need to make any changes to the documents approved in your original protocol, a modification will need to be submitted for IRB review and approval before the change can be implemented. This would include any changes to the study procedures, questions on a survey, changes to recruitment strategies or materials, or any changes to compensation methods or amounts. A modification will also be required if you need to change the study PI, faculty advisor, or a specially qualified personnel member. These personnel members have a specialized role in the study and the qualifications and/or training necessary to perform that role. For instance, the personnel member on your study that will conduct blood draws or that will be responsible for communicating with non-English languages. If you need to change, add, or remove any of these types of personnel, a modification will be required before the change can be implemented. Lastly, your study may require an annual continuing review. If your study requires this, you will see a protocol expiration date on your study in Mentis, and your approval letter will inform you of this requirement. Our office also reaches out with a reminder to researchers that have studies with this requirement. And if required, the IRB will need to review the amount of subjects that have been enrolled in the study so far, how many have withdrawn and why, and whether any unanticipated problems or non-serious adverse events have occurred. If you experience any unanticipated problems or serious adverse events while conducting your study, this should be reported to the Office of Regulatory Services by email immediately. Once you have fully completed your enrollment, subject follow-up, data collection, and any data analysis of identifiable data, then you will need to request to have your protocol closed in Mentis. It's very important that you do this, as the data retention period does not begin until you have an IRB closure date. You can request to have your study closed by submitting a modification or by emailing our office. It should be noted that any identifiable data collected in your study should be maintained for the full data retention period. If you have no intention of utilizing the identifiable data for analysis, and you are only planning to store it for data retention requirements, then you are still able to close your study. Again, all data collected in your study must be maintained for a minimum of 3 years from the IRB closure date of your protocol in Mentis. It is important to note that if you are a student who will be graduating soon, or if you plan to leave UTA before this period is up, someone at UTA must be responsible for maintaining the documentation for the rest of the retention period. If you are a student, this is typically your faculty advisor.
All right, great. Let's see. We're going to take a break, but before we do, we're going to have one more knowledge check. And let me pull up the question. So remember, first person with the correct answer wins a fast pass. All right, y'all got it. See. Okay, let's see. Who's the first person who got it? Mohammed Hussein got it. So you got the fast pass. Okay, well, let's take a short break. We'll take a break for about, let's say 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish out the conference. We have a few more sections. So see y'all back in about 10 minutes. So at 2:22, I'll put that in the chat. See y'all then. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We'll go ahead and resume the mini conference. So the next section is going to be on modifications to an IRB protocol and what that entails. Angie did cover that in her section, but I wanted to give y'all some more information about that. So let me share my slides with you. All right. So like Angie mentioned, any modifications to the protocol, to the approved protocol, have to be reviewed and approved by the IRB before you implement those changes. So this applies to all approved studies, including those determined to be exempt. And exempt means, this is a term that's confusing. Exempt means that it's exempt from the federal regulations for from the policy, the federal policy, but it doesn't mean it's not human subjects research. It doesn't mean it doesn't need IRB approval. It just means it's kept to a certain standard that's not the federal policy, but there's still standards here at UTA when you're working with human subjects. So modifications are submitted and approved through Mentis. So you would do another submission in Mentis to submit the changes to the IRB to review and give the IRB a chance to review and ask you questions about what you're proposing to change about the study. So failing to do a modification submission and get approval for it, before actually doing it, is considered noncompliance. So when the IRB approves your study, the application outlines exactly the procedures you're going to do. And so it's with that understanding that the IRB grants an approval. So if anything changes about the study, then that's why the IRB needs to see it before you do it, just to make sure all the protections are in place, everything's still safe, and the risks are mitigated. So some possible modifications could be you're changing a procedure in your protocol. It could be as simple as adding another visit or adding an instrument or survey. You could be adding or removing collaborators or study sites for your protocol. You could be changing recruitment methods. This is common if you're hitting a block in recruitment, if you need to change something about how you recruit people or add recruitment methods. Also, if you need to change the PI or faculty advisor, this would be a modification to the protocol that would need to be submitted. Any changes in funding need to be submitted. So if you get federal funding, you need to notify the IRB because, as we explained earlier, there's certain regulations that are applied when something's federally funded. And any changes to approved documents that you have, including the informed consent documents, and anything that you clarified there or in recruitment materials. Something new that we have is that if it's not a change to the PI or faculty advisor or an equivalent specially qualified personnel person on your protocol, you don't need to submit a modification for that change. So basically, we've removed a requirement to submit modifications for study personnel. Everybody else still requires a modification. Now we have a whole guidance page on this process and what needs to be submitted to the IRB as far as these types of changes. But this was to relieve the burden of having to get an IRB approval for personnel changes that are just study personnel changes. So hopefully this reduces the burden for our study teams. Now we have a web page now for on instructions on how to make a modification to the protocol. I've included a link here in the slides. Of course, everybody will be getting these slides at the end. when we send out the information in a couple of days. So basically what you would do, you go to Mentis, there's an option to submit a modification. So you modify an existing protocol, and then you start filling out the modification template. And in its template, it asks for a description of what you're changing. So this could be, again, procedures, inclusion, exclusion criteria, research sites. And then while you're doing these changes, consider how this impacts the rest of the submission document. So your protocol application, your consent form, any of your recruitment materials, if any of those things need to be updated. And then if they do need to be updated, attach them to the submission. So after your modification has been submitted, it will be reviewed by the IRB under the review pathway that it fits under. Again, this is according to the funding, the regulatory status, and risk level. If the IRB reviewer or specialist has any questions or there needs to be some revisions, it's going to be returned to you just like with the initial review. It will return to you in Mentis. You'll get an email that says it's been returned to you for edits. And then what you'll have to do is address all of the requests for clarifications, make the edits that are necessary, and submit it back to the IRB. And so it's important that you have all this process completed and your approval issued before you go ahead with the proposed changes. And whatever changes were approved by the IRB, do those exactly. Now I want to talk a little bit about non-compliance. So non-compliance is basically when the research is conducted not in congruence with the approved protocol. So this is a big umbrella of things. So this could be minor non-compliance where there was a deviation from the approved protocol procedures that didn't impact subjects in a harmful way or in a serious way. If that deviation or non-compliance did harm subjects, as in, increased risk for them, it impacted their welfare, then this would be considered serious non-compliance. Sometimes there's non-compliance that's continuing, and this is when there's a repeated pattern of violating the protocol. So all three of these types of non-compliance are IRB determinations. There's a procedure in a review process. When we get complaints about non-compliance or we find non-compliance, it's a process, a review process where we gather information, we generate reports, and if it's serious and or continuing non-compliance, these are reviewed by the fully convened IRB to make determinations like this. So it's important that, of course, that you avoid non-compliance because we want to protect the participants. But sometimes mistakes happen. So we encourage investigators, if you find a mistake in something, if you've something in the informed consent process went wrong or documentation went wrong, and you find it, we encourage PIs to go ahead and report it to the IRB so we can help you figure out the corrective actions to take. Because sometimes you'll need some guidance on how to fix the situation if things have gotten off the rails. And we always consider that when the IRB is thinking of corrective actions. If the PI is the one that came to us for help and kind of reported, hey, oops, we messed up, we always consider that when we're thinking of corrective actions, because we already see that the PI and the research team is looking to rectify it. So, if there's just retraining needed and things like that, that can be like a simple corrective action. So some common non-compliance findings over the years have been failure to obtain IRB approval. So the project ended up being something that needed IRB approval, because it was human subjects research, and there was no approval for it. So this was kind of found out after the fact. Failure to obtain informed consent. And sometimes there's, like I said, there's just a mistake or something like that where the informed consent didn't happen as approved, or the documentation didn't happen as approved. And so you can't show documentation that there was informed consent. And then, of course, just generally not following the approved protocol procedures. And so this could be any and all the procedures in your protocol. Everything that's outlined in your protocol is expected to be followed. And this is expected because of the whole risks, the risk-benefit ratio that has to be considered. So this is really important that everything that you've outlined in your protocol that will happen actually happens, and in the manner that you've described. And then another common non-compliance finding is implementing changes to the protocol without prior approval. And that's what we talked about with the modifications. You have to go through the modification process and get that approval before you start doing the change that you want. So some best practices for preventing non-compliance is thorough documentation. So this is documentation, of course, when you're submitting your protocol application, you make sure you document everything that you intend to do. And let's see, there's noise. Let me try to mute that. Okay. So we also encourage regular training, including protocol-specific training. So this is really up to the PI to give protocol-specific training. So there's this type of training, which is human subjects protections training, which is just generally, what do you do when you're conducting research, and to do it ethically and get informed consent and, mitigate risk and things like that. But protocol-specific training is the actual training to conduct the research that's specific to the protocol. So this is given by the PI or someone the PI delegates to train study staff on the logistics of carrying out the study. And then, of course, we always encourage clear communication within the study team. We've seen that communication problems is often the root of non-compliance findings. Something was missed because there wasn't clear communication about what was required in the protocol, or someone was misunderstood and thought something had been IRB approved when it wasn't. So when it comes to corrective actions and training, when non-compliance does happen, in the process, we like to identify what points in your processes or in the procedures were there failure points. And then we suggest improvements. We also will suggest, when applicable, to correct the study record. And so this could be just a note to file or a note in the subject record somewhere that this was corrected, or this is what was done to correct the mistake. And then we often suggest training or retraining will help identify the people that need that training, and then what training needs to happen. We have a lot of options. We have human subjects protections training, and then there's other training available through city and other modules that are free that can be used in certain circumstances to retrain. And then the role of the IRB in preventing non-compliance is doing things like this. We provide training in the fall semester, spring semester, this mini conference. We provide the online training and Mentis for human subjects protection. We try to give as much guidance as possible on our web pages. We think of every frequently asked question that we have, and we write up a guidance and we put it on our web page so that people can find it and find the answers. And we try to regularly communicate anything that is changing as far as requirements or policies or federal regulations and what's expected of investigators. And we do that through the research newsletter and also our PI listserv. So if you're unsure if you're on these listservs, let us know and we can get you on those. And then also the IRB, of course, is going to monitor compliance through our functions of, when we receive a concern about something, we often initiate our non-compliance procedures to see if this is something that is a violation or deviation of some kind, and sometimes even adverse events. All right. Let's see. Okay, so that was the end of that section. Let me see, is there any leftover questions? Let's see. Do we have any outstanding questions, Angie or Kelly?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Great. All right, so our next section is protecting human subjects' electronic data, and our presenter is Edward.
Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, and you can see me too. Awesome. All right. Glad to be here with you all today. I'm Edward Gonzalez. I'm on the research support services team in the Office of Information Technology. And today I'm talking to you about some basic approaches, just some really high-level stuff about data safety, the tools we have available here at UTA, how to access some of those tools, different concepts around that. I'll be going full screen, so I won't be able to watch the chat. So if someone could just give me a heads up in case there's a question along the way. There we go. Cool. So kind of a bottom line up front, keeping your data safe. When you can, use UTA provided tools. That's the #1 way of making sure that you are going to be in compliance with the different rules and approaches and expectations when it comes to any data at UTA, but especially research data. Staying inside of the tools that UTA provides means that you're taking advantage of everything UTA has already done to validate those tools and to make sure that they're safe for the kinds of research and uses that we undertake here at the university. But we know that sometimes you're going to need tools that are outside of UTA's existing portfolio of software applications, platforms. There's a way to go about approaching those needs. We'll talk about that. We're going to take a moment to talk about student employees and how student employees, especially the ones who are also GRAs and they have this employee identity and they have a student identity, some approaches to managing that. And that all has to do with the fact that students, every single one of you is going to graduate, and one day you won't be a student anymore. That also means that some things like your student accounts are going to come to an end. How do we figure that out, and how do we plan ahead for that, so that that super important file that your faculty sponsor needs in order to publish that paper, 6 months after you graduate in a journal, that they have that, right? We'll also talk about how any project, but especially research projects, do have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the solutions and approaches that you use for data safety during one stage may not necessarily be the solutions and approaches that you use for later stages, and especially once you get to an end. So first and foremost, if you can, use UTA provided tools. Now, hopefully y'all are already familiar with myapps.uta.edu. That is your front door for most of the applications that UTA makes available to faculty, staff, and students and administrators. So if you go to myapps.uta.edu, you're going to get this big list of tiles. Files and file sharing. Use your UTA OneDrive. If your research team has a SharePoint, or if your research team needs a SharePoint, use UTA SharePoint. Surveys, UTA has Question Pro. You need a website. UTA has an instance of Campus Press that for most static sites, ones where we're not trying to deploy an application, there's usually no cost to the researcher. For collaboration, Teams, we're using Teams right now, Microsoft 365, being able to share spreadsheets, Word documents, PowerPoints, those kinds of things. Up in the corner, there's a share button. It's wonderful. You're able to share those materials with anyone who also has a Microsoft account, but especially inside of the UTA bubble, anyone who has a UTA account, right? AI chatbot, Microsoft Copilot, and we'll talk about AI specifically, right? So kind of what does this mean? Don't use Dropbox, don't use SurveyMonkey, don't go out and get a WordPress. Don't hop onto Slack. Don't use, Google Docs, Google Sheets, those kinds of things. And I'm not saying never to use them. I'm saying that with UTA data, which does include research data, it does include the data that you're collecting as part of these research efforts. We want you to use the UTA provided tools for that data. Okay. But of course, sometimes there are just applications, tools, software that you need that aren't already in UTA's portfolio. Okay, so big asterisk right here. The process for this changed this summer, okay? And so a bunch of folks, a bunch of IT folks and others like procurement people are putting our heads together right now to build out and mature this new process, right? So the big asterisk that I have is this is a process that's in development. And so the process that I'm describing to you right now is what it is right now in fall 2025. In the spring, it's going to be a little bit different. And when we get to this time next year, it's going to be a little bit different, hopefully more mature, and everybody will have a better understanding of it. But as it is right now, so you think there's a need in your research for an application that we don't have, whether that's to do some analysis or that's to collect data or whether that's to do any of the number of things that you may need to do in order to accomplish your research goal, So if you go to ServiceNow, which is the IT ticketing system, and you go to professional services, purchasing, software review request. These days, the first step towards getting a piece of software that's not already in UTA's available software portfolio is to submit this software review request. If you are a student, your supervising faculty member will need to do this on your behalf, right? Faculty, because you're going to be shepherding that process through for your student. When you kind of think of it in terms of, if there's going to be some sort of acquisition cost, student can't spend university dollars. Faculty, that's your burden to bear. But then faculty employees, of course, that's your piece to do. When you fill out this form, it's thorough. Have some detail in your mind. Who's selling the software? What are you going to use it for? About how much is it going to cost and how are you going to pay for it? Notice that this also includes free, right? If it's free software, say it's free software. But do be thinking about cost and funding source. You'll need to have that in mind when you fill this out. The types of data that you use with the software, identified human subject research data is considered by UTA to be confidential, right? We want to have that in mind, that as we interact with the people who review software, that you very much intend to to use it with confidential data. And that also fits into, is it cloud software? Is it not cloud software? What do I mean by that? If you access that software through a web browser and that's the only way you interact with it, probably cloud. If it is a program you download and it runs on your laptop and you don't have to be online for that software to work, like maybe it's some sort of statistical analysis software or something like that, that's probably not cloud. Does it have an AI component? That's a state thing. They want to know all the AI stuff we're using. Does AI have nothing to do with it, right? Answer the questions to the best of your knowledge. Take your best shot at it. Part of this process and part of the way that this process is maturing and changing is that there is going to be a conversation that initiates, especially if there's complexity to the request. So that's the software review process that we have right now. Like I said, if you go to the ticketing system, click on the professional services tile, click on the purchasing link, and it's called software review request. Things like the TAP rec, things like the ISO cloud review that some of y'all may have heard if you've been here for longer than a year. If those are required, they come downstream in the process, and you'll get advice out of the software review request process as to what your next step is. Hardware purchasing. Maybe you need a fleet of iPads so you can do surveys. Maybe you need a desktop so that you can dedicate it to doing number crunching, whatever, right? Small systems. This has recently changed as well. So laptops, desktops, tablets, the kind of things that we think of as being, we call it endpoint computing. You're going to submit the endpoint request form. Students, again, same deal. Y'all can't spend UTA money directly. So if there's a need for an iPad or something like that, work with your supervising faculty. They'll work with you. Have an idea of what you need, how many, how you're going to pay for it. And that's like a cost center or something like that. Maybe you don't know what you need. Maybe it's a question mark. Maybe you need help. Well, there's a box on that form that says, I know I need something. I don't know what that something is. You check that box, you can consult, and then someone from the endpoint team will take a look at your request and get that consult going. Same thing, ticketing system, computers, printing and software, desktop and mobile device support, endpoint request form. That's the form that you fill out to do that. Y'all will get this slide deck, so don't think you have to take screenshots or photos of these things. Large or non-standard systems. So for example, you need a system that supports instrumentation. You need something that has more performance, or it needs a big GPU in it, or even something that needs to go on a rack because it's high power, those kinds of ideas. It's not an endpoint. You can submit the research support services consultation request directly. Students, theme still holds true. If you need to fill out a RSS consultation request, just fill out the form to the best of your ability, because in all cases, filling out the consultation request form is going to initiate a contact from an RSS team member, maybe me, and we'll talk to you to discuss your particular use case, your specific needs, what your research is trying to accomplish, the resources that you perceive as being important. We do a pretty deep dive because we want to make sure that we understand your research and that we give you good advice. And there's the click chain for finding an RSS consult. Okay. Storing data outside of UTA. So earlier I mentioned Dropbox, I mentioned Google Drive, I mentioned, Sheets and iCloud and all those services that we all know and love and even use in our personal lives. Check with someone before you store UTA data, which includes research data, in these services that are outside of UTA. So I'm not saying that there are not reasons to do it. Perhaps you have an institutional partner and they're a Google school, and so they're inviting you to Google Drive so that you can drop data in or pull data out as part of a partnership. Hey, we're here to help you think through those use cases. We're here to help you make sure that that use is safe. We're here to help you navigate, even technical or mechanical things that you may need to do in order to make those kinds of collaborations possible. A-okay. But that comes out of a conversation about this is what I'm being asked to do. It's outside of our normal guidance. How do I approach this? always happy to have that conversation with any researcher who's trying to figure these things out. That said, be careful about who you share data with, right? A lot of the tools that we do provide do have sharing options, even inside of the institution. If you need to share data with John Smith, with Maria Gutierrez, with whoever, there's probably more than one of them in the address book. Make sure you get the right one, right? Just to make sure that your data are going exactly where you intend them to go. When you use ChatGPT, when you use Grok, when you use Gemini, you are absolutely giving your data to that vendor, to that corporation. Are you training an AI model when you use ChatGPT and you don't pay for it? No, not directly. Are they absolutely going to use your data when they consider how to build out their services? Yeah, they will. And so that's part of why UTA has agreements with different vendors, so that we receive assurances that they're going to use our data appropriately, right? When you go out there and you use these quote unquote free services, or when you use services that are outside of UTA's bubble, UTA has no expectation or assurance that our data will be handled properly, right? And then I mentioned an instance of like accidental sharing. So just make sure that when you do share data, or when you do use a service, that you're using the right one and the one that you intended to use. Some of you may be dealing with restricted data that's above and beyond just our normal categories of public, controlled, confidential. You may get access to a data set. You may be dealing with especially sensitive data. You may be, here's the things that you may encounter may have additional rules. Check with someone. Okay. So if you feel like, well, there's this paragraph of requirements that I'm supposed to have, don't just assume it's okay. Have a conversation with somebody. That's a great reason to fill out an RSS consult request, is to talk that through. Much better to have a conversation and find out that you're A-okay, than to get a notification down the line saying you're being audited. We're going to ask you how you've been doing these things, and that's the first time you really think about it. If in doubt, don't share it, don't take a copy, ask a question, right? There are folks here who will help you understand these things and think these things through. AI. In all cases, please follow UTA's AI guidelines. If you go to the ai.uta.edu, up at the top banner, you will see the guidelines. Those are still that's still a great starting place for when you think about using AI here at UTA. Students, please follow your instructor or supervisor's AI requirements. Read your syllabus, follow the rules, okay? And be aware of other requirements or restrictions around AI. Like, here's a good one. Some of y'all may already know that, for example, if you are an NSF reviewer, the NSF does not want you to use AI as you do your reviews. Be aware, right? UTA does have Copilot. And so part of UTA's agreement with Microsoft does include access to Microsoft's AI chatbot, which is called Copilot. There's a link to it. There's more than one way to get to Copilot. That's one of the more direct ways. Log into Copilot using your UTA email address, whether you're an employee, a faculty, staff, or a student. My rule of thumb, although there's nuances, my rule of thumb is that if it's okay to store your data in UTA OneDrive, it's probably okay to chat with logged in Copilot about it, right? And when you think about it, OneDrive is Microsoft, Copilot is Microsoft. Again, there's that relationship there. But of course, there may be situations of more nuance. And so if you have questions about it, again, get in touch with someone, get in touch with me, ask a question. We're happy to help you think through these use cases. take a moment to talk about student identities. Had some real heartbreak cases around this, which is why I take a minute to mention it. Students, when you graduate, your student account will eventually be closed, right? And that means, you know, your UTA OneDrive, your student OneDrive, you know, your UTA, some of these services that are associated to your UTA student identity will come to an end. They'll be turned off, right? Have a plan for the data that you need to keep before that happens. So just as you're thinking about crossing the stage, the data that you're allowed to keep, make sure that you are doing something that's appropriate with that, so that when we get to the point of, you know, hey, we're turning off your OneDrive in 30, your UTA student OneDrive in 30 days, that's not a panic. Faculty, what this means is that if you are sharing, there's a need to share data, and particularly when we come to like needing to publish an article, or we're going to be putting out a paper, and that, you know, that publication is going to take place sometime after the student graduates, faculty, you probably want to be the one who's sharing that OneDrive folder, who's sharing that PowerPoint, who is sharing that Excel from your account to the student. That way, when the student separates from the university, because of the happy result, that those files stay with you, right? Just that one little bit of consideration can save a lot of aggravation. That's not to say that, you know, oh my gosh, the student's OneDrive got turned off and I need these Excel spreadsheets. Can you do something about it? If you let us know in time, like within a couple of days, yeah, there's usually something that we can do about it. But again, that's stressful. There's urgency. We have to move fast in order to make sure that we don't hit permanent deletion deadlines, those kinds of things. So much better to think about upfront. Hey, I'm going to need this data after the student graduates. I'll share the folder. They'll put the Excels in there. They'll put the PowerPoints in there. They'll put the manuscripts in there, and then I'll have them after they leave. Employee accounts and at employment termination. So kind of same deal. GRAs, lab assistants, those kinds of things. Make sure that they are using a lab file share, like a lab SharePoint, in order to store things that are for the benefit of the lab, that are for the benefit of the research group. And make sure that if you don't have one of those, or you don't want one of those, that you're still sharing from the faculty's OneDrive down to the students. So those things stick around even after somebody stops being a GRA and that employee account gets closed. So student employees, how do you choose between the two? If you're doing work on behalf of your research team, you know, you're helping your faculty member with a research effort that they're doing, use your employee identity. You know, if you're logging on to resources in the lab to use instrumentation, that kind of thing, most of the time you're using your employee identity. If you're doing work for your own academic aims, like, you know, this is for my project, this is for my thesis, this is for my dissertation, use your student identity, right? There's a fuzzy line in between, but that's the general gist of it. All research projects have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The graphic here is actually the NIST research data framework, and it's a loop. Envision, plan, generate, acquire, process, analyze, share, use and reuse, preserve, discard. Then you start again. You think about the next project. You plan for it. You get your data. You analyze your data. You share and reuse your data, and then you decide what you're going to keep and what you don't have to keep, and it goes away, right? The point that I want to make with this is that the tools that you use for data are going to be different as you move through this cycle. At the beginning, you're really thinking about, where are my data coming from? This may be data sources. This may be like something you get from the library, something you get from a data vendor. This may be surveys that you conduct. Like, you know, this may be acquisition platforms, like, you know, an EEG cap, and you're pulling data down onto a piece of instrumentation, right? Those are data sources. And typically we're going to say that your acquisition platforms, if at all possible, shouldn't be where you store data throughout the project, right? You want your acquisition platforms to be just that, sources of data that then you move downstream into your OneDrive, onto the computer where you're going to do the analysis, into a shared folder in your OneDrive where you're going to share that with a research partner. That's also probably where you need the most data protection. And so when you think about, you know, I want to make sure that my data are safe. Using OneDrive means that there's a copy of it in the cloud, and that something could happen to your laptop, for example. We don't want that to happen. But if all your data is up in OneDrive and something happens to your laptop, we're really sad about your laptop, but your data will still be there, and you can go to any other safe computer and get to your data, right? So that middle part where you've gotten the data, you're working the data, you're getting to a result, where you're putting in the work, right? You're putting in the work. Please, please, please use tools, especially OneDrive, to protect that data, okay? But then at the end, right? Maybe not everything you collected is necessary to keep. Maybe you may even have requirements to get rid of certain data or not to keep certain things. Maybe you have other requirements that you absolutely must keep certain things, like the 3-year requirement that was mentioned earlier. Think through. Don't just make an assumption that the data storage solutions that you used for acquisition or even for your working storage during the project are appropriate platforms. And maybe that's just as simple as you have a folder in your OneDrive that says, you know, completed projects or an archive or something like that, so that you know that you've put that away and it's not being shared. It really is something that you keep as a record for yourself, right? Wouldn't that be funny that, you know, you don't turn off the sharing and then somebody else comes in and they think, oh, well, I can grab a copy of this data for this other thing I need to do, and they mess up your whole thing, right? Just be thoughtful, right? When you get to the end, think of, how am I going to put this in a state where I can depend on it to be a record, to where I've cleaned up, to where it's the end. Hey, and I've met, you know, any sort of data archive requirements that I have for publication, which is always really nice. Whether that publication is a journal article, a book chapter, your thesis or your dissertation, that's the happy end, right? All these little decisions add up, and that's really what data safety is made up of. How you're getting the data, where you're keeping it, how you move it from place to place, what those tools look like, who you're sharing it with, who has access to it, who can modify it. Do you do thoughtful things at the end of the project to make sure that you've kept what you need to keep and you've gotten rid of what you need to get rid of, and you've shared or published the things that you need to share? All those little decisions along the way add up to your overall data safety, and just being thoughtful and conscientious about how you handle your data as you handle it and move it and process it at all the little steps of the way, is how you end up with a good result. Again, I'm a member of the OIT Research Support Services team. Always happy to hear from any of y'all. You can either submit an email, oitrss@uta.edu. You can always go to the OIT ticketing system and fill out a consultation request. Students, you can always reach out to your supervising faculty and say, I think I have a research IT question that I'd like your support in approaching the research support services team. We hear from the IRB team a lot. We hear from the research security team a lot. We will take inputs. We will take questions. We will take contacts any way you care to get them to us, because we really are here to help with any IT for any research project. And we're very interested in making sure that your endeavors are successful and that we've helped facilitate you getting the right IT tools for that success. I don't know what this dude is doing to the table. I wouldn't necessarily think that's good IT practice, but then again, I'm not a horse.
I was gonna say I love the horse thing though, because of Mavericks and all that stuff. That's very cute. I like it.
Any questions or chats that I missed?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions. Let's see. Before filling this software request, where can we find the UTA approved software portfolio?
Okay, so that's part of what's changed is that one of the things that has to get reworked is what that approved software portfolio looks like, right? There's absolutely value in having a list like that to make it convenient and easy to understand what's out there that's immediately usable. Right now, the best thing that I can give you as to what's out there that's immediately usable is to go to myapps.uta.edu, and if you can click on the tile and access the service, that's immediately usable, right? I don't want to get too far into administrative affairs here at UTA, but our president is really interested in making sure that UTA has a good handle on the software that we use and the software that we buy. And so part of that is a data gathering exercise. You can kind of fill in the rest. And so for now, fill out the software form. And if it's something that's, if you're asking for something like SaaS, right, you're going to get a response back pretty quickly saying that SaaS is in the portfolio. Here's a help article on how to get it. Off you go, right? I know that's steps, but again, just where we're at in rethinking processes as an institution, as a university, it's where we're at. Yeah, go to my apps. If it's there, use it. And then for other things, I have to go through the process. Even for the software that I want to buy, there's no shortcut for anybody. Other questions?
That's helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. Good to go.
It's good to go.
Yeah. Let's see. Another question. I was staff when I began my studies. I had a staff email address. They gave me a student email too, but I believe they deleted that and student emails began routing student emails to my original employee email. Will I have two accounts so I can keep academic content separate?
Okay. So are you still a staff member now? And looking at your bubble, you do have a staff identity. And so those are going to coexist, right? So as long as you're a student, you're going to have a MAVS identity. And as long as you're an employee, you're going to have a uta.edu identity. And that's what I was saying, kind of making sure that you use those appropriately, because when you graduate, and if you're still an employee here, that staff identity, that student identity will come to an end. You pick up the next opportunity, for your employment while you're still a student here. That employee identity is going to come to an end before your student one. So yeah, you're going to have to use them. Just make sure that you're sorting out between the two. If there's complications there that I'm not perceiving from your question, feel free to reach out to me personally, and I'll try to help you figure it out, or at least get you pointed in the right direction.
Yeah. Okay. And we have a question about how often we do this training course. We do this fall and spring. So we'll do this again in the springtime, January, February, for the whole community.
Cool.
Let's see. Another question. How would one request a lab SharePoint site?
Send me a consultation request. We'll talk over your need.
Okay. Let's see. What's the UTA approved equivalent to SurveyMonkey?
Question Pro. You can find it in myapps.uta.edu. Q for Question Pro, and it's one of the tiles that you can click. Particularly Question Pro. Again, we talk about accounts coming and going. Supervising faculty, if you need a copy of that data, make sure that you are either hosting the surveys in your Question Pro and you're sharing that down to the student, or students that you are scrupulously conscientious about sharing survey instruments and the data contained within with your faculty member. A lot of heartbreak over that one.
Yes.
Trying to make it better.
Yeah. These are good questions. Y'all had some really great questions today. Anything else for Edward or anything else for us with IRB submissions or human subjects protections? Well, all right. Like I said, we'll be sending out the slides from today so that y'all can reference it. We've also recorded this today and we'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel so that you can also review the recording. And like we've mentioned, as always, feel free to reach out to us in Regulatory Services if you have an IRB question. Edward's also shared his contact information for him and his team. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.